my calculations are correct, when this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious shit.
Back to the Future is an amazing film. It has a gold star cast, brilliant character writing, timeless special effects, and the direction from Robert Zemeckis easily rivals any of his other films, including the likes of Forrest Gump. It also makes absolutely no goddamn sense. Hi, I'm Raymond McNeil, the Celtic Phoenix, an avid fan of time travel fiction, and I'm here to tear apart one of the most famous time travel films of all time. Because when I see people talking about these films, these are problems that people rarely ever seem to complain about. And really, they should. Most complaints boil down to, why doesn't Lorraine recognize that the Marty that she gave birth to is a spitting image of the Marty that she knew from high school? Or, why are people so trusting of Biff after everything he did in 1955? And this is to say nothing of the later films in the franchise that only raise further questions with all the temporal shenanigans that go down in those. But I'm here to tell you that they are all dwarfed in comparison to the biggest problems suffered by the Back to the Future franchise, and it's localized entirely to the first film. The rules of time travel in Back to the Future fundamentally contradict themselves. What do I mean by this? Let me elaborate. But before I do, a shout out to all of my new patrons. Look, I know this is annoying, but this video gets into some weeds and I couldn't find a more natural break. I'd rather people follow my train of thought unbroken, so we're doing the patron read here. I'd like to welcome to the bonfire, Toon Spectre, YoJack87, Molly the Angel, Terry, Crystal Dragon Cinzy, Sydney Martinez, Rumix, 7EBO55, Fallen Hero 36, Danny Boy, Stone, Marcos Aguilar, Regal Knight, Brock Butler, Dabitari, and Chaos Spartan 575. It's wonderful to have you guys supporting the channel, and I hope you're all enjoying yourselves in the Tundra Discord server. For $1 or more, you too can gain access to the Team Frostbite Discord server, the Tundra, where I and other familiar faces from around the channel hang out on the regular. Join us for fun group events like weekly watch parties and Bad Fanfiction Night, which I host almost every single Friday night. We all have a lot of fun, and I hope to see you all in there. Thank you for your patience, and now, back to the full video. When I'm talking to someone about time travel and how so many properties get it wrong, almost inevitably they say something along the lines of, yeah, well, time travel is complicated. The other most common thing for them to say is, who are you? What are you doing in my house? Where's my wife? And then usually it's followed by a lot of screaming. And regardless, my reply to that most common response is, time travel is very simple conceptually. People make it complicated. Most people seem to think that there's only one kind of time travel, but in reality, there are many archetypes of it, and they all have their own rules to abide by and limits on storytelling. And this has nothing to do with quantum physics, or power sources, or complex equations, or intricate magic spells. These are the means by which the movie says, hey, I have time travel, suspend your disbelief that I do. Those can come with their own pitfalls, but no, I'm talking fundamentally about how the world reacts when someone travels into the past. To date, there are 3 common archetypes of time travel that crop up in media. The first and easiest to explain is the immutable timeline. A character travels back into the past with the intent to change the future, only to discover that everything, even their interference in the past, is completely set in stone. Attempts to change the future, like curing a disease or murdering an infamous world leader, are all thwarted seemingly by happenstance, poor timing, and even dramatic irony. No, it turns out, your cure for polio ended up causing polio. You can't kill Hitler because, plot twist, you're Hitler. The extra irony on that one is that eventually you'll succeed. The second and slightly harder to conceptualize archetype is the paradox. This is when a character travels into the past and changes it in a way that would effectively prevent them from changing the past in that way to begin with. Most commonly, this is referred to as the grandfather paradox, where a person goes back in time, kills their grandfather before the conception of their parents, and thus erases themselves from existence as a consequence. But because they no longer exist, they cannot go back in time and kill their grandparent, so the grandparent lives. The grandparent being alive leads to the birth of the character who goes back in time to kill them, and everyone involved are stuck in a horrifying loop while the rest of the world just keeps on existing as normal. Or maybe the universe explodes. I don't know, there's a lot of different ways to handle the consequences of a paradox. Most realistically is that time travel would just not function in that reality, but storytellers can try and finagle around that, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute here. Third and finally is my personal favorite, the alternate timeline. This is the archetype where, upon setting foot in the past, you've either just created or have slipped into an alternate timeline from the one you're originally from. The most famous example of this is probably from A Sound of Thunder by Ray Bradbury, where a hunter goes back in time on safari for a T-Rex that was already supposed to die, only to get scared, run through the forest, and step on a butterfly that wasn't supposed to die. This ends up causing changes big and small to his timeline, from English being slightly different as a language to a fascist candidate winning a major election. An interesting quirk to this one is that there's no returning to your original timeline. Sure, you can influence or not influence the events of the timeline so that things line up and appear to be the same, but underlying all of that, things have still changed on an almost molecular level, just by you visiting the past. It kind of invokes that Stephen King quote about terror. Everything in your house has been replaced with an exact duplicate, and you'll probably never shake the feeling that things aren't quite right. Effectively, ask your story what happens when someone goes into the past, if only for a second. What does it tell you in return? If it says, you were supposed to do that, nothing has changed, it's an immutable timeline. If it says, stop, you can't do that, it's a paradox. And if it says, you can do that, and now everything is changed, you've entered an alternate timeline. These three archetypes, you may notice, are pretty incompatible. If you have an immutable timeline, well, then you can't change anything, and thus you can't create a paradox, and you can't enter an alternate timeline. If you can create a paradox, well, your timeline isn't immutable, and it isn't splintering off into its own timeline. And if you can create an alternate timeline, your timeline isn't immutable, and you cannot create a paradox. Those familiar with Back to the Future may see where I'm going with this. It's rare to find a property that mixes these different archetypes, and rarer still to find one that makes them all work. Doctor Who comes to mind because I'm pretty sure every form of time travel is experimented with in that show, but when the show includes a line like,
"It's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff,"
to describe time travel, I'd hesitate to call it functional. Best you get with that show is to examine the time travel within individual story arcs and then try to ignore all the other episodes of the show that directly contradict it. Steins Gate is the only property I can think of that manages to balance not just two, but all three of these archetypes within its own story, and it requires a variety of means in order to do so. It's a rich and entertaining story, but it put a lot of legwork in to reach that point. Back to the Future doesn't. It ends up employing two of these three archetypes simultaneously, and neither of them end up gelling. Initially, when our protagonist Marty McFly goes into the past, we're introduced to the threat of a paradox. He's inadvertently interfered in the origins of his parents' relationship, and reality is starting to change to reflect it. First, his siblings begin to fade away from a photograph that he has, and then he himself begins to fade away as the climax of the movie approaches. We're already getting into weird territory with how the paradox should work. Theoretically, once you create a paradox, you should cease to exist immediately. There's no room to fix your mistakes. However, this is one of those moments where we have to give the film some leeway. It's given us an established consequence for time shenanigans and how it's going to be metered out. It doesn't need to line up 100% with how physics would actually work, so long as it sticks to its own logic. Unfortunately, after Marty manages to restore his parents' relationship and his own existence, it's only 15 minutes until we find out that we've not actually been operating on paradox rules this whole time. We've been operating on alternate timeline rules. Marty returns to the future, and immediately things are different as a result of his temporal dalliances. Famously, one of the first differences is Twin Pines Mall being changed to Lone Pine Mall, a reference to the pine tree he ran over when he first arrived in 1955. It's a cute little detail, but we'll gradually see that even more has changed beyond that. Even more significantly is of course Doc Brown wearing a bulletproof vest in preparation for the Libyans after reading Marty's letter, a vest we have no indication he was wearing at the start of the film. Of course, it could be hidden in such a way by Doc to ensure that Marty acts the same way he did when he goes to 1955, but we'll get to that. Of course, the most prominent change we witness when Marty returns home for the night is the change in his family's wealth and the entire unit's dynamic. Gone are the callous, disheveled, and poorly employed schlubs. In are two considerate, well-groomed, and white-collar siblings. No longer are his mother and father seemingly indifferent to each other and actively unhappy. Now they're successful and fawn over one another. Strangest yet, the main antagonist, Biff, has been demoted to effectively a lackey of Marty's dad, and is seemingly eager to see him succeed even more. It's a wonderful ending to the film, as Marty gets a new life of luxury, a happy family, and even scores a new truck out of it all. It's very clear when you're looking at it that this is an alternate timeline. We don't even need the sequels to confirm that. But if you remember what I said before, the paradox theory directly contradicts the alternate timeline theory. They're incompatible. If the movie were to employ a paradox theory the whole way through, then anything Marty did in the past in relation to his parents, anything at all, would basically stop him from existing. It doesn't matter if he killed one of them outright or just gave them a wedgie. Doing so would fundamentally alter the him that exists as he is and the environment he grew up in, preventing him from taking the exact course of action that led him to the event in question. I could maybe give them some leeway with the kind of paradox they've presented. It could play well with a semi-immutable timeline where Artie is actively interfering in things, but putting them right restores his future to how he remembers it. Then, using all the information he knows from the past, he could improve his family's lives by helping them sort through their frustrations. Not perfect, but far less contradictory than an alternate timeline. Conversely, if the movie were to employ alternate timeline theory in the first place, then Marty would never have been threatened with non-existence. With no warning indicator, the timeline would simply continue with whatever changes he'd made, and then when he returns to the present, he'd simply find a reality that had never heard of Marty McFly. He'd have to either suck it up and forge a new life for himself in a world that never knew him, or he'd have to travel back and try to fix the mistakes he made in the first place, to achieve some level of normality like we saw at the end of the film. In fact, we already know this is effectively what should have happened. I kinda touched on it earlier, but there's a new character introduced at the end of this film that we only see on screen for a couple of seconds. Marty McFly. That is, the second Marty we see at the end of the film fleeing from the Libyans at Lone Pine Mall. It's rare to see anyone else consider this, but that Marty, Marty 2 for simplicity's sake, is not the Marty we've come to know over the course of the movie. Our Marty, Marty 1, was raised by two parents who seem to have lost interest in each other and their own lives, raised alongside two shiftless siblings working dead-end jobs, was raised in a dilapidated neighborhood with few, if any, amenities. Meanwhile, from what we can see, Marty 2 was raised by two attentive and supportive parents, has kinder and wealthier siblings, and seems to have the lap of luxury to fall back on. If you don't think that those factors may have influenced how Marty 2 turned out as a person, I'd have to question your perception of reality. Even if the changes to Marty as a person are small, the fallout from those changes could have catastrophic implications. A change like that is a domino where Marty 2 creates his own alternate timeline, leading to a Marty 3, a Marty 4, a Marty 5, and so on. Let's take this a step further. How lucky is it that the events of the chase happen almost verbatim to how Marty 1 remembers them? His entire life is completely different. Hell, it's a miracle that the family didn't move into a nicer house considering how successful they seem to be. Can you imagine him accidentally breaking into a stranger's house thinking it was his own and passing out on their bed? And what about Doc? Does Marty 2 have the same personality and disposition to Marty 1? He must if he's friends with Doc, unless we presume that Doc artificially sought out Marty as his assistant. In fact, we don't see them interacting at all before Marty 2 leaves the film, so it's possible their entire dynamic was different and Doc was just waiting for the real Marty to appear. And if you really want to get dark with this, Marty 1's original timeline thinks he's effectively dead. He never comes home that night from Twin Pines Mall, and Doc Brown's body is hauled off to the morgue. It's probably assumed he died in one of Doc's experiments involving the uranium. He's outlived by his family and girlfriend who will never have a clear answer for what happened to him, and we know this because his photograph with his siblings from the original timeline is still completely intact. They haven't changed, Marty has just hopped into a different timeline. Time travel can get very, very twisted very, very quickly. But I am not so jaded as to not recognize the reality of things. Plotting any of this out following either theory 100%, while more than feasible, would probably have undercut the more lighthearted tone they were going for with this film. It's obvious to me they wanted to have fun with the alternate timeline theory of time travel, but they needed some kind of ticking clock element, hence why they brought in the paradox effect. For the layman, it's quick, easy, and no one sensible is going to question it. Hence why I'm sitting here, saying that I'm not a sensible person. But likewise, I'd very much appreciate people stop referring to this film as one of the best time travel stories ever told. It's not. It's a wonderful popcorn film to sit down and watch. It has incredible levels of iconography. It has infinitely quotable lines, hilarious gags of all calibers. But it's not a good time travel film, and it's alright to admit that. If you want to pop this on and turn off your brain to the underlying logic, I won't blame you. In fact, I'm going to do that myself every single time from here on in. But if you want some well-written time travel to sink your teeth into, I can offer some recommendations. Most accessible are probably Terminator 1 and 2, Groundhog Day, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time. These films are less focused on the time travel itself and more focused on the story, but the time travel they use is typically consistent while running in the background. In the middle ground of accessibility are Steins Gate, Star Trek, and Stargate. I know I'm supposed to be recommending movies, but these TV series touch on time travel frequently enough that I feel like they're solid recommendations. I mean, Steins Gate is all about the time travel, and you can't go a season in the other two shows without encountering some sort of time travel episode. They require a little time investment to get a little more out of than a movie, and it's certainly true that not every time travel episode of the Star Trek or Stargate series are home runs, but if you're looking to explore time travel on a more technical level, then these are go-to options. Finally, the least accessible, but still excellent time travel films are Primer, 12 Monkeys, and the spiritual predecessors of 12 Monkeys, La Jetée. La Jetée? La Jetée. It's French. These films are easily the hardest to get into from a layman's perspective, often suffering from high concept syndrome where you have to really strain your attention. However, if you're willing to do that, you'll find these films to be incredibly well made, and they are excellent at demonstrating both the boons and horrors of time travel. Of everything that I've listed, I really recommend both Primer and Steins Gate. They're kind of my go-tos in terms of really, really good time travel. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Like I said, I understand that Back to the Future just wanted to be a fun movie, and I love it for that. It's the people holding it up as something that it's not that I take issue with. And I hope I've convinced some of those people out there to maybe give the film a reappraisal. If you like this content and content like it, all I ask you do is like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell if you want to know when more content like this is coming up. If you want to take your support to the next level, though, consider throwing some money at me through Patreon. I already did my whole ad read for it at the beginning of this video, so if you're curious, you can always just go back into the past to check it out. Or you could just rewind the video, probably less chance of creating a parody. That's all from me for now. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Raymond McNeil, and I'll catch you all on the flip side.